So, multithreading is basically running multiple processes simultaneously. Now, before I had said that programs run code line by line from top to bottom. So, think of process 1 here as the instructions that the program will run when the program executes. Now, let's say that one of the instructions in process 1 is to run another set of instructions at the same time in parallel. Let's call it process 2. At this point, we have two sets of code which are running at the same time. Now, let's say that process 1 contains variable a. If process 2 tries to access variable a, which is in process 1, one of two things can happen. One possibility is that the operation fails. This is because variables can only be accessed by one process, or thread, at any one time. Now, this does not mean that the program will crash. The implication of this is that process 2 will just not have an updated value for variable a. Process 2 will otherwise just keep running until it is stopped. The other possibility is that variable a is not being accessed by process 1. Thus, when process 2 accesses variable a, it actually gets an updated value. This is the basic idea of how multithreading works. In practice, it's quite complicated and hard to do correctly on a large scale. The example which I'll be showing is a simple demonstration of how it works. First, I'm going to make a new file, call it multithreading test.cpp. And then we have the usual include stuff, so iostream, and then we have our main function. And here we are, return 0. So, I have already looked this up, and I have found a resource. This is what I found. First off, I have to use this library here. So, I'm going to include the thread library. So include thread. Alright. Now what I'm going to do is make a function to run in a separate thread. This function will do nothing but print a message to the terminal as soon as the thread ends. It's not really doing anything, so it doesn't have to return anything. So I'm going to make it a void function. So let's call it wait for trigger. And this function will stop when it detects that a variable is of a particular value, so it does need a parameter. So I'm going to make that a string, so I have to include string. Now what I'm going to do is make the parameter a pointer. The function has to know when the trigger variable has changed value, so it has to directly access the value of the trigger variable. The sole purpose of this function is to wait around for some unknown amount of time and constantly check if the trigger variable has changed. Since I'm constantly checking for a condition, and the condition is unknown, a while loop would work just fine. Now I have a while loop, so what is the condition? I'm going to make a flag variable to keep this loop running. So I'm going to make that a string and call it loop run status, and the value will be running. So the loop will run as long as the value of this is running. So here we are. Now, within the loop, all that really has to happen is just check whether or not trigger is the value that triggers the function. So I'm just going to also call it running. And that's the condition that I'm checking, so I'm going to put it inside of an if statement. And then what I'm actually going to do is change the conditions so that it checks if the trigger is not running. Doing it this way might be a bit easier, considering that the thread stops when the trigger is not running. So, when the trigger is not running, the first thing that I want to do is close the while loop. I can do that just by making loop run status, which is the condition of this loop. I can just make it a value which is not running. So I'm just going to go not running, and that should end the loop. And after that, I'm going to print a simple message, which is thread has finished. And just to make it a bit more clear that this message is coming from the thread, I'm going to put 5 dashes in front of it, and here we are. Great. And one more thing I'm going to do, I'm going to print a message when the thread starts. And once more, I'm going to denote the message from the thread with 5 dashes. So I'm just going to call it thread starting. Alright, so that's done. Next, I'm going to make a loop in the main function. So this loop will run until the user decides to exit out of the loop. How I'm going to do this is I'm going to get the user input. So when the user types in no, the loop will exit. So I'm going to make a variable to control the loop, and I'm going to call it user loop status. And I'm going to make the condition of the while loop as long as status is running. So as long as the loop is running, I want to ask the user if they want to keep the loop running. So basically, to enter no to stop the loop. So enter no to exit the loop. And for this example, messages from the main function will not be marked by 5 dashes. So end the line. And to get input, I've done this before, so I need to make a variable to hold the input. So let's make it a string, call it user input. And then I've done this before too, and get the user input into the variable. So into user input I go, and then I'm going to check whether or not the input is no. And if the input is no, so if user input is equal to no, then I'm first going to output a message which is loop is exiting, end the line, And then the first thing I'm going to do is close out this thread here. So exit the thread, which I'm not doing just yet. Then next I'm going to close out this loop. And I'm going to do this by changing the value of user loop status to anything which is not running. So I'm just going to change it to not running. Okay. And finally, I am going to, at the very end of the program, print out a message to the terminal saying that the program is exiting. So before I show the multi-threading part, I'm just going to test this to see if there are any errors. And I'm just going to enter in a bunch of random things. And I'm going to enter no. And it looks like everything works. So now, how do I run a process at the same time that this program is running? For that, I'm going to look at the source that I found. It looks like here, they've made a function called foo, and it takes a parameter. And here, they are creating a thread which runs the function foo. So I guess that's what I'm gonna do. And it looks like it's just std thread, because thread is a standard library. And then the name of the thread, and then the parameters. Alright, seems easy enough. So, I am going to start the new thread up here, I guess. So spawn a new thread, and SD thread. I want to call it parallel process. And what function do I want? I want to run wait for trigger. And I am passing to this function a pointer. Now, this pointer points to the trigger for this thread. So first, I have to make the trigger. So I'm going to make that a string. Call it thread trigger. And I set up here that the value of it should be running when the thread is running. So here we are. And because I'm passing a pointer to this function, I've got to do this and then this. Okay. And, oh, whoops. Now, let's see what else I have to do. It looks like we have to wait for the threads to finish. So the thread that they created was this, which is down here, and .join. Okay, so I guess I'll just put that in at the end. So the thread was parallel process and join. Okay, what happens when I run this? Thread starting. So this function is running. That's good. And now I'm going to type in a bunch of things which are not no. And now I'm going to type in no. And then I see loop is exiting. Now at this point, the program is supposed to exit. So why is it still running? Well, the mistake that I made was that I forgot to close the function that's running in the thread. So I'm going to do that real quick. So the trigger was thread trigger. So to exit the thread, all I have to do is just make the value not running. It doesn't have to be that value specifically, just a string, which the value is not running. And now it should work. And I'm going to type in no, and the program exits. Now, this is the output when I type in no. The loop is exiting, and then the thread has finished. Is that the correct order that the messages should appear in? The answer is yes. Yes, it is. Now, to show what happens when one process is occupying a shared resource and another process is attempting to access that shared resource, I'm just going to move this print statement to the end. So I type in no. Now, this change that I made didn't really change the program in any meaningful way. That print statement just fires off at a different time. So now, what's the output? I see thread has finished, but I also get loop is exiting on the same line. That should not happen. The fact that the message from the thread is on the same line as the message from the main function means that when I change the value of the trigger variable to end the thread is still running at the same time. Now, I'm going to run it again. So I type in no, and it happens again. This lack of synchronization can cause problems. These problems can be as minor as, say, something not happening when it's supposed to, or as major as a catastrophic error. The solution to this is called a mutex. What a mutex does is basically when a process is attempting to access a shared resource, but that shared resource is occupied, that process will simply wait until that shared resource is available, then continue running. So, how do I use a mutex? Well, I've already looked this up, and here's what I found.